You're listening to episode 11 of the Microprose podcast, in which we embrace nostalgia and gaming history alongside three industry veterans, Jim Squires, Andy Roberts, and Pauli Kidd.
Hello and welcome back to the Microprose podcast. We are Dan Tozer and Nancy Knott, and today we are talking about nostalgia, retro gaming, old school hardware, and the rapid evolution of the industry.
Our featured guests today are Jim Squires from Commodore, Andy Roberts from Thalamus, and Pauli Kidd from countless games you definitely played in the 90s.
This episode is slightly different from our usual format. Instead of chatting to the developers of a specific game, we'll be talking about games more broadly, with highly respected legends of the industry.
So, whether you like to play games, make games, or reminisce about the games that shaped your childhood, there will be something in this episode that resonates with you.
If you're a fan of Microprose, chances are you've been playing games for a while. And if you've been playing games for a while, you've probably experienced nostalgia. Not just nostalgia for particular games, but for moments.
Microprose emerged during a period where home computers were transforming from niche curiosities into creative platforms that would shape an entire generation. The company became known for pushing the boundaries of what games could achieve, particularly in simulation and strategy. Titles like F-15 Strike Eagle, Gunship, Silent Service, Railroad Tycoon, Civilization, and XCOM helped define genres that continue to influence game design decades later. Microprose wasn't just making games, it was helping establish the language of modern PC gaming.
What makes that legacy particularly interesting is that it mirrors the broader story of the industry itself.
Many of today's developers, publishers, journalists, artists, and players began their journeys on machines like the Commodore 64. For countless people, those early computers weren't just entertainment devices, they were introductions to programming, design, storytelling, problem solving, and creativity. They showed an entire generation that technology could be a medium for imagination.
The guests that you'll hear from today all lived through different chapters of the gaming story.
Jim Squires from Commodore represents a company whose hardware introduced millions of people to computing and gaming. Andy Roberts from Thalamus brings the perspective of a publisher whose work helped define an era. And Pauli Kidd offers the viewpoint of a creator who has witnessed the industry's transformation across multiple decades of development.
Together, their stories reveal something fascinating. While technology changes constantly, many of the motivations behind making games remain consistent. Curiosity, creativity, innovation, the desire to build experiences that people remember.
Those values are also reflected in the modern incarnation of Microprose. Strategy games, military simulations, historical experiences, and management games all helped establish Microprose's reputation in the 80s and 90s. Over the last few years, Microprose has built a catalogue that embraces many of the same design values that made earlier generations of games so memorable.
At the same time, these are unmistakably modern games built for contemporary audiences and modern hardware. Something we find interesting about the current Microprose catalog is that it demonstrates how a legacy publisher can honor gaming history without becoming trapped by it.
For example, Sea Power, Naval Combat in the Missile Age, belongs to a lineage of naval strategy and simulation games stretching back decades. But its focus on Cold War era missile warfare creates an experience that simply could not have existed in the same form during the heyday of the original Microprose.
Task Force Admiral draws inspiration from the great naval command games of previous generations while pushing the genre in new directions. The developers openly acknowledge influences from classic naval strategy games, including Microprose's own historical catalogue, while using modern technology to create a level of immersion that earlier generations of hardware could never deliver.
Microprose's catalogue is not limited to hardcore strategy audiences either. Tiny Combat Arena takes inspiration from accessible flat combat games that introduced many players to the genre during the 80s and 90s. Its stylized visuals and approachable controls make it immediately welcoming while still providing meaningful tactical decision making. It captures the excitement of classic air combat training without requiring the encyclopedic technical knowledge often associated with modern flight simulators.
Perhaps the most surprising recent example is Death by Scrolling, published by Microprose and created by Ron Gilbert. Gilbert's influence on gaming history is difficult to overstate. As the creator of Monkey Island and Maniac Mansion, Ron helped define the language of the point-and-click adventure genre and inspired generations of developers.
Death by Scrolling deviates from the point and click format, combining Gilbert's trademark humor with vertically scrolling action. It challenges players to survive purgatory while gathering enough wealth to escape the afterlife. It's pretty fun. And the result is a game that acknowledges gaming's past while embracing one of the most popular genres of the modern era. In many ways, it perfectly encapsulates the philosophy behind today's microprose respect for history, paired with a willingness to explore new ideas.
Looking across these Microprose releases, a clear pattern emerges. The modern Microprose catalog isn't built around nostalgia alone, although nostalgia is definitely present. Microprose draws upon decades of gaming heritage as a foundation for innovation. Microprose Games recognizes that players still value depth and meaningful decision making. They express those ideas through contemporary design, modern technology, and new perspectives on what games can be.
Maybe that's why the Microprose name continues to resonate with players today. Not because it represents a return to the past, but because it reminds us that fun never goes out of date.
Nostalgia isn't just about preserving old hardware or collecting boxed editions. It's about recognizing the ideas, communities, and creative ambitions that connect generations of players and developers.
Technology can change, distribution can change, business models can't change. No, that's a lie. They can change. Everything can change. But the fundamental human desire to explore, create, learn, compete, and tell stories through games remains constant.
And that's the real lesson of gaming history.
The past isn't valuable because it's old. It's valuable because it determines the present. It shapes the future, and it influences our lives, whether we realize it or not.
So today, we're taking a journey through that history to learn about where games come from, where they are now, and where they might be heading next. Let's get started. Today, we're exploring the wonderful worlds of retro gaming and nostalgia, from the past to the future.
Today's episode is a really special one for anyone who's ever loaded a game from a floppy disk.
Or spend hours exploring pixel worlds on one of the most iconic machines ever created, the Commodore 64.
Today, we're diving into what it means to bring classic technology into the modern era with the brand new Commodore 64 Ultimate.
And joining us today is someone right at the center of that revival, Jim Squires from Commodore.
Hi, Jim.
Hey,
Welcome.
everybody. Good to connect. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. So, if you're listening, Jim Squires is Commodore's Chief Strategic Officer, Strategy Officer, Fire Putter Outer. I don't actually know. What's your official title, Jim?
Honestly, all of those work. I think my business card says Chief Strategy Officer. I like Chief Fire Putter Outer. That feels good. But
It's very official.
no, it's a pretty broad role. So yeah, Chief Strategy Officer is a nice catch-all, I think, for sure.
Excellent. So, just before we jump into things, can you give us a little bit of a glimpse at what your role involves and what you kind of do in the
Yeah,
Commodore world?
absolutely. So to step it back just a little for the context. So the Commodore brand was reawakened, I suppose is the best way to put it, last summer by a great gentleman named Perry Fractic. He's our CEO. He had a wonderful vision for what this could be, and we're moving full steam ahead, which is very, very exciting. So my role, the best way I can kind of describe what I do is if Perry is piloting the ship, I'm helping to navigate the course, which ensures that we get to where he wants us to go, which is great. Similar to that, I have a counterpart, a chief operating officer named Emily McGinley, who's fantastic. And while I'm helping chart the course to where we go, I would say she's the one making sure that all hands on deck are doing what needs to do to get us there. So it's a really nice dynamic. We have a tremendous leadership team across the board. Our CTO, our CFO, all these folks are contributing. Just wonderful stuff to make sure we're living up to the new Commodore vision, which at the end of the day is all about things like the Ultimate, which we love, but also kind of building towards the future that we all wished for back in the 90s that it seems like has been side railed a little bit. So we're trying to build back. We'll see how it goes.
Definitely. And so let's start at the beginning because that's where
Please.
nostalgia lives. Jim, what's your first memory of the Commodore 64?
Okay, so this is going to be a little embarrassing to say out loud, and I'm going to put it out in the wild now, so I can't put the toothpaste back in the tube after this.
I put her
But
out her.
unlike most members of the Commodore 64 team, I did not own one growing up, and that is a shame I will wear till the day I die. However, I like to think I actually represent a really interesting and maybe even broader group of people who love Commodore, and those are the folks who desperately wanted one growing up, had friends who had them. For everyone who had a Commodore 64, they had 4 or 5 friends who didn't, who came over and played it and loved it and wanted it in their homes and their hearts. So I was that kid. Lots of memories. There are probably things that predate what I'm going to mention, but the thing that usually sticks out the most in my mind, and I love any opportunity to reach out to an audience with this question, so I'm hoping someone who hears this can help me. I have a memory probably 86, 87. I was probably like 7, 8 years old, that window. And I used to spend every summer with my aunt and her kids. It was lovely, really good memories. And that was the most time I had with Commodore 64. My older cousin Matthew was about 10 years older than me, so like the cool teenager, mid 80s, love it. You can picture it. He belonged on the cover of Rad or things like that. We would hang out in the basement and he would introduce me to all the just the most incredible games. And there's one that's always stuck with me. And to this day, I cannot figure out what it is and it's killing me. So I'll paint the picture for you. It was a multiplayer racing game, horizontal split screen. So we've got, the one track or the one racer on top, the one racer below. And I'm picturing these almost like F1 style vehicles with big wheels in the back, almost comically large wheels. It had like a drag race energy to it, but there was also kind of construction kit energy to it. And like the closest I can come when I search is the Racing Destruction set, which is, on its own fabulous. All the construction set pieces that EA put out were incredible back then. But it doesn't, and like parts of it make me go like, maybe I'm mashing up a 7-year-old's memories of 2 different games into one game, which is possible. But it's, when I play it, I'm like, man, this feels close, but it's not triggering the response I'm expecting it to. So if anyone knows what the heck I'm talking about, my God, please tell me. You will solve a 40-year-old mystery and I would be very, very happy.
That's a direct order, by the way, if you're listening. Please help. This is an emergency. So was there a specific game, moment, or whatever? Maybe it's that one. Maybe it's the one you just said that made you realize that the Commodore 64 was something special.
My gut always goes to California games. It's the game I definitely have the most memories of playing on the Commodore 64. It's one of those games that everybody had, and every time you visited, it was like you could just take turns, going around the room, getting frustrated and performing poorly in California games. But the reality is, like, I could have had that experience on an NES as well. There were a lot, that game hit every platform, and I'm sure I did, So that's not a Commodore 64 experience that made me realize it was something special. I think the thing, and I'm going to say it was an experience I had on the Commodore 64, but I think it was what painted the difference for me between what you could do with console gaming and what you could do with a home computer. And that was Maniac Mansion. Because the reality is, as great as everything on a home console was back in the day, they were not designed for games that took patience, that you had to sit with, that you had to digest. Other video games were frantic and felt like a 22-minute episode of a TV show, whereas something like Maniac Mansion felt more like snuggling up with a good book. It was funny and it was fun, but it was that great, slow, puzzly feeling, and it really opened me up to what that could be. So my love of adventure games started there on the Commodore 64. Over the years, it definitely grew. I enjoyed plenty of Sierra stuff in the DOS era, things like that. I distinctly remember, and I don't know if this was every kid at the time, or I just hung out with like an extra, very specific type of nerdy group, and I'm delighted I belonged to it if that was the case. When you go and have sleepovers and things like that, I feel like other kids would be staying up all night, passing the controller around to play Bionic Commando or Mega Man 2, stuff like that. And we would sit around playing like King's Quest. We would, as 10-year-old boys, we would do that ridiculous thing of staying up way too late till the parents were asleep, and then firing up Leisure Suit Larry only to be hit with the age gating, which was the best age gating that ever happened. They were doing things like asking you questions about the Beatles. It's like, hey, you would know because you're old enough, right? It was fabulous. And it was pre-internet, so we could not just find the information. And Lord knows we sat there and guessed night after night. And I don't know many nights that we actually broke through, but Lord knows we tried. But yeah, Maniac Mansion on the Commodore 64 was really the pivotal point for me discovering my love of point and click. And over the years, that has never waned. I love a good slow game. I love a good meaningful game. You see so many things in the indie space nowadays that are sort of capturing that. I really feel like the whole industry is, knock on wood, hopefully moving back to indies and AA games that are more story driven as opposed to endless, multiplayer, free to play, transaction driven stuff. I'm seeing a slow renaissance happening. I kind of hope it takes off. Fingers crossed.
Like, why do you think the Commodore 64 still has that such a hold, like a strong emotional pull for people decades later?
Well, I mean, it's a right time, right place scenario, I think, for the Commodore 64 in the best way possible. It was, thanks to a number of reasons, it was everybody's, well, a lot of people's first home computer, right? It is still to this day the single greatest selling home computer of all time, 27 million units. We hold the Guinness World Records for that, which is the weirdest thing I've ever said for a product I've been associated with, but very, very fun to say. There were a few things that led to that. One was, well, actually, I'll give you a good comparison. And it may actually be only the first time I bring up this totally unrelated device on this call, but it's where a lot of my love and passion goes to. So there's always comparisons. It reminds me a lot of the Game Boy. Why the Game Boy worked is a lot of why the Commodore 64 worked. Because when the Game Boy hit the market, were there technically better handhelds? Absolutely. And I mean on a technical level, right? What the Lynx could do was incredible. But it took 8,000 batteries and lasted 4 minutes. The Game Gear was not as bad for that, but similar. The Game Boy came out and said, we're at a really low price point. We got there by compromising on things, but it also means you have battery life. You can have a wide library of games. It's not as complex to program for as these other titles. And it blew up. It was fabulous. It became the de facto, like when we talk about handheld games, the shorthand for that is Game Boy. Just like, in the 80s, which I don't know if either of you are old enough to remember, but we didn't really say video games in 1987. We said Nintendo. Like parents would be like, oh, they're playing Nintendo. It didn't matter what you were playing, right? Like it became the Coke or the Band-Aid of the era. And I feel like Game Boy is very much the shorthand for that. The Commodore 64 had a similar situation. It entered the market around the same time as, there was the Apple II. There were some IBM PCs on the market. It was very early versions of what we eventually became the norm. But we're talking thousands of dollars for these, or at the very least, like high three figures. And the Commodore 64 came out at $549, and within a year dropped to $399, making it a cost-effective alternative. Commodore had already proven themselves with the VIC-20. Everyone knew that we had the chops. This was not a fly-by-night operation. And the reality is, too, that all of us sitting here think of Commodore, maybe I'm assuming too much, I apologize, but I feel like the default assumption is, Commodore is a product that started with the Commodore 64, or that, started with computers, but like Commodore's been around since 1958. It is a storied, established company, parents who would be buying their kids or buying just for themselves a home computer for the first time. A lot of those folks worked in offices, and a lot of those offices were, swamped with Commodore typewriters, Commodore filing cabinets. It's Commodore Business Machines was the name of the company for a very long time, and there's a reason for that. So there was brand familiarity. There was an appropriate price point. What it was capable of was insane compared to what you would get on machines that cost 2 to 3 times as much. So it was a perfect storm moment, which was great. And then similar to that, because it spread so widely based on those pieces, we ended up with, I'm going to say again, similar to the Game Boy, it kind of had its Coke and Pepsi moment in that it was everywhere. Like if you did not own a Commodore 64, you had a friend that did. That was it if you grew up in the 80s. So it was, at the time, I would argue, and I don't think anyone would dispute it, in the same way in the early 80s, we associated home consoles with Atari. I think we associated home computing with Commodore, and the brand was just as significant, if not more. The other piece that I also think is really fascinating when you look at the history of Commodore, and sorry, I know this isn't a video podcast, but everyone just saw me put my hand to my head daydreamily now because I'm thinking about it. I apologize. I have to paint a picture here for folks because I realize how ridiculous I must look, but here we go. So this is now where I get into one of my many other boring hyperfixations, and that's, again, as a child of the 80s, is the Cold War. And when the Iron Curtain started to come down, not specifically in Russia, but for a lot of the Eastern Bloc countries, it was their first opportunity to get their hands on Western computing devices. And so around 1990, Sure, the Commodore 64 was 8 years old at that point, and in North America, it had been supplanted by the Amiga in a lot of ways. By MS-DOS was really sort of establishing itself for IBM PCs, which is I have to explain to my kids the term IBM PC. I'm like, that was on every box, guys. I know it means nothing to you. IBM is a I have to explain IBM, despite still, I think, being a massive corporation. They're just not, the household name they used to be. But yeah, while the West was starting to explore those things, Commodore saw the opening and said, we have great computers. These people don't know what to do with them yet. Let's start delivering to Eastern Bloc market. And so there's a whole generation of coders that came up in like 1990 to 1992 in places like Yugoslavia and the Czech Republic, who made their bones on the Commodore 64. So this really, it is a product that managed to break beyond the North American and European, or at least Western Europe footholds that normally you equate with brands like this. So I think that really helped us establish a real global imprint, which is great. I mean, obviously, I don't believe we ever did as well in Japan as a lot of their own homegrown stuff. They had incredible stuff in Japan already, but yeah, there's a real universality to the Commodore brand and the Commodore 64 specifically. It's something I think anyone who was alive in the 1980s and above the age of 5 had an experience with the Commodore 64. So that's just something that sticks, I think, with you forever, right?
And there's something almost ceremonial about retro gaming. The sounds, the loading screens, even the limitations. Do you think modern gaming is missing some of that?
Yeah, very much so. So I'll tell you a little story. And as I knew we'd get back to Game Boy, I apologize. But I promise it all ties in, and it really paints a picture that you then stop and go, oh my God, that's the Commodore 64. And it really, really is. So outside of Commodore, one of the projects I've been involved in, I run like the teeniest, tiniest indie game studio you've ever seen. I'm telling you, if it was a Monopoly piece, we would fit inside the thimble. It is small. We're called Rocket Ship Park. We're based here in Ontario, Canada. And, we had initially made our bones making mobile games. We pivoted and started doing some larger kind of PC indie projects, things like that. And the team is really myself and my partner, who is the technical and creative wizard, if I'm being honest. I'm the guy who's really good at signing the checks, making sure the bills get paid. But he blows things out of the water. And we had a point a few years ago. We went out for dinner and he said to me, Jim, I think I've just lost my spark. Like, it doesn't interest me. It doesn't challenge me anymore. I'm not feeling it. It's like, I think we need to go on hold. I'm like, yeah, it's fine. No problem. We're both, it's the 21st century and everyone has to have 9 different hustles to compete. So it's one that we could all put pause on. It was fine. But I had asked him at that time, I said, if there's anything that would get you interested again, what do you think that would be? And he said to me, he's like, I think I'd like to try the challenge of programming Game Boy games one day. He's like, I'm not there yet, but maybe. I'm like, okay, no problem. And then because I'm a sly, sneaky guy who just like, how do we make the pieces dance? As chief strategy officer, let's put the word strategy up front for a moment. Before we had left the table at that dinner, I had slyly under the table, got my phone out and ordered him an analog pocket, because I'm like, well, if he wants to go down this road, let's give him a new device he can play with. Let's make sure that, one day it'll be sitting there in the closet. 2 years from now, he will pull it out and start fiddling. Maybe. Let's give him the chance. And that's what happened. And now he is, I think we may have released just our 10th Game Boy title recently. He's absolutely prolific in that space. For anyone who's listening to this who might be big in the Game Boy homebrew community, he's the gentleman who made things like Cave Dave and Starseed. And we actually just did our first official port of Roguecraft, which is very exciting to the Game Boy Color.
Congratulations.
So it's great. But yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. And one of the things that when I talk to him about it, I'll tell you right now. So he's my friend Shane McCafferty. He's absolutely wonderful. EG Vroom on all the socials. If you're ever looking to follow him, he's a great follow. But he is such a good speaker on game development and design. And I can't always get him on a stage. Sometimes I just get him, over a coffee, and it's still just as good. And he will talk until you're blue in the face about how developing for retro is so crucial for any developer working in the space today. Because the reality is, we're at a point with things like Unity and Unreal, all these like engines that you can throw a little bit of money at every month, and it opens up the world to you. I hate to sound hyperbolic, but what you can do right now is literally the limits of your imaginations. It might take money and it might take time, but the tools are there now to realize pretty much anything we want to realize in a comparatively frictionless way. That sounds really great, but it's not. I will maintain, I don't know if you guys are, I mean, there's a million ways you could look at it, whether it's books or music or film, but I'll argue that any creator you love was at their best before they were a success, because the difference before and after was before they had an editor or they had a publisher or they had someone to answer to that was going to say no to them, that was going to say fix this, that was going to say change this. They were going to put them in a box, right? They were going to put on limitations that these folks now had to work within to make the best possible thing instead of being surrounded by yes men. I will maintain to this day, and I appreciate his name is not one we want to bring up a lot anymore, but I will maintain to this day that the best thing Neil Gaiman ever did was Sandman. And I know he's done great stuff since then, but the reality is when he wrote Sandman, he had an editor, and that editor said no to a lot of stuff and kept him on the tracks, right? Developing for retro systems is very much like that. You know, you are the editor in this case is literally the constraints of the platform. So Shane will always talk about what's great about developing for retro is you're designing within that box. And that means to get what you want, you can still get you what you want. You can still have the full dream, but to actually achieve it means, how do I find a corner of this box that nobody's found yet? How do I push the walls of this box out in a way nobody's done it? And you can, like, the proof is absolutely in the pudding. This is so far beyond concept, because if you look at the very best Commodore 64 games that came out in the 80s, and you look at what the community is making today, it is a night and day difference. You would think they're developing for different platforms, because we've now had, God, I wanted to say 30 years, but it's closer to 40, isn't it? My God. We've had 40 years to look at this and figure out what can work, what doesn't, to learn from modern game development and different approaches that we've taken there, to understand what's possible and what's not, and just do the incredible. So anyone listening to this that might be a modern game developer and you only worked in things like Unity and Unreal, and no disrespect to that or your work, it's incredible and it is hard, and I'm not saying it's not. Do yourself a favor and pick up a Commodore 64 Ultimate, or if you don't want me to be a commercial, pick up literally any platform, and just try. Just learn something new and push the envelope and push the boundaries and see what you can do. Yeah, I think, and at the end, because you have those constraints, I think we're getting better games. You know, that's it. Modern games today, it's interesting to me. So, okay, I have a soapbox I get on sometimes. So the games industry right now, in general, and this is no secret to anybody, I'm talking the wider games industry, not just the retro corner. I think we're actually very healthy right now in the retro corner. The modern games industry is going through probably the biggest crisis moment we've had since 1983, when the industry first collapsed. And it's for a lot of the same reasons. We've done that thing where, like, as an industry, we learned from 1983 and we made changes, and that's why we decided to thrive. Like, we were able to thrive again, and enough time has passed that we've forgotten those lessons. So we're seeing things like the abandonment of curation, right, is one of the reasons we got here. You know, Apple opened the doors to everybody. If you have $129, you can have an App Store developer membership and you can release whatever you want. Again, sounds great. Like, limitless possibilities always sounds amazing, but the problem is sometimes limits are there for a reason, right? That flooded the market. You know, we had, I will argue, and I will maintain that one of the best periods of gaming that ever existed were maybe the first 5 years of iPhone games. That was, it lined up almost like succinctly with the birth of that era of indie games. And so all of a sudden you got incredible developers, you know, 1-person, 3-person studios who are able to make unbelievable games with new technology, pushing the boundaries of what people could do with the iPhone. Nobody even knew what to do with it yet, right? They're testing things, they're trying things. And the games that came out of that are among my all-time favorite games. There's no way around that. I was fortunate enough to be very close to that scene at the time. I started my bones in the games industry, as like so many people, as a games journalist. And my beat was mobile games, which was not a common beat. And so it made it a really fun niche to get to explore. And to also not feel led by the other coverage. You know, everybody in the world tells you how to think about Call of Duty. Nobody is telling you how to think about, you know, great old puzzle games like Rules on the iPhone or things like this, or my God, how is there an Indiana Jones game on here nobody's heard of and it's fantastic? You know, all this sort of stuff, right? But as we got to a point, you know, where all of a sudden with mobile games, my brain's breaking on this. It's such a big topic in my head, and I'm trying to stuff it all back in. We got to a moment with mobile games where it shifted. There's always a balance in games where it's a balance of art and business. You know, at the end of the day, what we're making is incredible. I will argue endlessly that video games are the most compelling form of art that exists in the 21st century. It's the only form of art that takes every discipline of art and combines it and then literally puts you in control of it, right? You have to immerse yourself in the art. It's really, really fascinating. And so that art piece always has to be there. If we lose that, if we lose why we're making and what we're making, there's nothing left. The business part has to exist because people have to make the money to keep making the games. There's just no way around that. That's how art works. The starving artist is a term for a reason. The problem with games has always been when the balance shifts too heavily to the business side, eventually, and this, I would argue, this is the economy self-correcting itself, greed consumes all and breaks things. So 1983, that's how we got to where we got to. All of a sudden, anybody could publish games for the Atari. And that meant everybody would publish games for the Atari. I'm based in Toronto, and here in Canada, we had a store, may it rest in peace, it closed about 10 years ago, but it was, everyone loves it forever. It was called Zellers. It was, I guess, our equivalent to a Walmart or Target. And I have in my storage unit Atari 2600 games made by Zellers. Like, it's like, what? Like, everybody who thought they could make a game and slap some money on it did it. The market flooded. All of a sudden, games that used to be able to pay a full price tag for were in bargain bins, for $5, $4, $2. And the market collapsed under the weight of that. And people couldn't sort the wheat from the chaff, right? Nobody knew what was a good game, what was a bad game, unless you were a diehard who was reading magazines or things like that at the time, or listening to hopefully the recommendations of your friends. But the reality is, you go into a store, you look at something and say, sure, you came home with it, it was crap. And we broke the home console market. It took a very fresh approach from Nintendo to fix that at the time. Same thing happened here. I would say it's a 15-year tale that started with the iPhone launch and has ended where we're at today to get the industry where it's at. So yeah, like I said, there's a lot of things that go into it, but I think a big part of it was removing curation, which meant we flooded the market. By flooding the market, we had to drive prices down to compete. And so all of a sudden, we're now at a point in 2026, and we've been here for years, I couldn't even tell you how long, where a 99-cent iPhone game is going to fail. You cannot make money if you charge money for a game, period. That's insane to me. And without naming any names, I will say I've talked to people inside at Apple where I would ask questions like, is there anywhere this is working? How is this working? And the short answer is no. And when you look at like streaming service or subscription platforms like Apple Arcade, that's how that came around. Because these game developers who make genuinely great games on their platform, the ones that people actually should be playing, can't make money, so there's no point in being on them. Poor Jeff Minter, for God's sake. And I love Jeff Minter, man. Llamasoft is one of the all-time greats. Some of his best work were iPhone games, and it made no money. And at the end of the day, he ended up pulling all the games because he didn't want to pay the $129 annual fee to keep them on the App Store because they just weren't making any money. Like, that's insane to me that those games are now lost forever, and so many great games are because of that, because games preservation is another area that nobody is investing in and I will say it again, props to Atari, with the exception of Atari, who bought Digital Eclipse, who I still maintain they're like the Criterion collection of video games. They're doing more for preservation than anybody else out there. I think preservation is so important. And at Commodore, that's actually within my scope, is digital preservation. That's something I'm really, really interested in and trying to figure out what we can do to bring back classic Commodore games and make sure that they remain playable forever. It's certainly not our main focus. As a platform, the reality is it's a thriving ecosystem, and it has been since the bankruptcy back in 1994, because we have the single best community out there. And I know that sounds like I'm blowing smoke, but like literally the only reason the company was able to come back as it was because the community acted as stewards of the brand for, I'm doing the math in my head, I don't want it, it makes me feel so old, 31 years. That's a very long time to continue making hardware projects, to continue developing new games, to do meetups, to stay involved, to run magazines and put out books. And like, the Commodore brand never went away. And thank God to that community. So for that community, we want to make sure that our focus is on new projects, right? Developing new things, making sure that there are great new games, making sure that we can support those developers and publishers. And honestly, any who are listening to this right now, if you haven't talked to me yet, reach out, please. There's a contact form on our website, or if you know Nancy, just message her and she will give you my email. I'd be very happy to give that out.
I'm just so curious because you're talking about that intersection between preservation and reinvention. So how does the Commodore 64 Ultimate fall into that?
No, that's a great question. So the first thing, let's talk about the preservation piece. What's great about the Ultimate? So the Commodore is for anyone listening who does not know. I don't want to. I hate assumed knowledge. I was taught the term assumed knowledge a few years ago, and I love it. Like when you talk and you just assume people know what you're talking about. That's not healthy. So a little bit of a primer so people know what the Ultimate is. The Commodore 64 Ultimate launched last December, December 2025, and it is a, forgive me for saying so, flawless recreation of the Commodore 64. You've seen a lot of projects over the years, not just for Commodore, but from everybody, where you'll get genuinely great devices. You know, I still use to this day my Super Nintendo Mini that they put out a few years ago. I've been replaying A Link to the Past in my brain for the last month, and I'm dying to fire that thing back up and get going again. I love these things, but the reality is they are intended to preserve, which I, again, 100% love, the games more so than hardware. Right? Hardware preservation is actually really, really difficult, especially because, and you would think like, oh, you could make this stuff 40 years ago. It's got to be easy to do now. Actually, that makes it very hard because the way things have been manufactured has changed drastically in the last 40 years. The things that even exist, like to manufacture them, they're not there anymore. You know, the way, like, for example, the way a SID chip was made, from what I understand, and I'm pleased if I get this wrong, everyone, I apologize. There's no way to do that today. Right, like that's where we're at, you know. So there are certain things where it's not doable. You know, the reason CRTs aren't back is because nobody has the manufacturing capability to make CRT televisions anymore. It just doesn't exist anywhere in the world, right? Like things have changed. So to preserve hardware, and again, this is where we go back to that incredible community Commodore has, right? When you see so many of the hardware projects that happened over the last 30 years, those happened because people wanted to make sure that their Commodore 64s could keep operating, right? So it was like, hey man, we can't keep buying 10 or 12 used units somewhere to strip them for parts. And you know, what can we do to come up with replacement parts? What can we do to make things that will make this go, that will make it last longer, that will help update it for what we need, things like that. You know, it is 2026 right now. And unless you are a giant dork like me, and I will share with the camera because of course I'm a giant dork, you probably do not have a CRT sitting on your desk right now. Which, you know, if you had a Commodore 64, the original, that's what you would need. So, you know, there have been modifications that would do things like add HDMI ports or, you know, add better storage, things like this, all sorts of stuff you could do. So the Commodore 64 Ultimate is, in many ways, it's sort of born of that community. It's born of a lot of those projects. We are powered by an FPGA board that, you know, initially was a community project, right? It was a great gentleman named Gideon. His board is what's inside our machine, and he's a member of the Commodore team now. It's great. So we're able to ensure hardware preservation, and a big part of what makes the Ultimate great for hardware preservation isn't just recreating the original experience flawlessly. It's ensuring that everything that you already own from back in the day will still work with the modern hardware. So if you have a joystick from 1984, if you have the old disk drive or a data set or any of these things, they're going to work flawlessly with this device. If you have a homemade controller that worked on your Commodore 64 that you bashed together one day in 1997 in your garage, it'll work on the Ultimate. We claim 99.9% compatibility because we appreciate there's probably going to be some outlier out there. But that being said, we actually stand by it so much that I am going to Coventry in the UK next week for Zap Live. I'm very excited. And as part of our presence there, we are doing the first ever Ultimate Challenge, which is basically like, hey, Commodore community, this is, and Zap Live is like, it's all Commodore fans, all enthusiasts who've been around forever. It's exactly our market. All of our folks that we love. So, hey, bring in everything you got, test it on our Commodore 64 Ultimate, see if you can find something that doesn't work. If you do, you're going to win something. It's kind of like our update of the Pepsi Challenge, but heavier because you got to bring stuff with you. So,
and more fun.
Yeah, I hope so, right? More fun and sort of quietly. Also, not that I want people to find the 0.01% of things that don't work, but it'd be great if they do, because then that's something that we can look at and try to figure out in our next firmware update. Like, what can we do to address that? What can we do to fix that, right? So yeah, that's the hardware side. That's really important. The game side is a little more complicated, which I know sounds like it shouldn't be. But as anybody who has ever had to deal with retro games from the business side knows, it is generally a tangled mess of intellectual property rights. And so we're not out there at the moment, and it's not in our roadmap. It's not something we're intending to do. We're not out there trying to scoop up IP. We're not trying to buy IP or own it. We don't want to be a game publisher. We want to support game publishers, right? We want to help the people who are already out there making these great products get things out into the wild. We also want to help studios, or even folks who were formerly studios who have moved on, who hold classic IP, we want to help them find new audiences. And that, whether that is on the Ultimate or through other paths, right? Like it's a case of come talk to us. If you hold IP for classic Commodore games, stuff that was a huge hit on the C64, my God, ask Nancy for that email. Seriously, I cannot stress it enough. I really want to talk to you. I'm going to be shaking hands with everybody at Zap Live next week, and I think it'll be like, "Hi, I'm Jim. Do you own any classic IP I should know about?" So we want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to help old games remain preserved and exist out there in any and every way that they can. I genuinely cannot say enough good things about what Digital Eclipse does. And separate from all of this, I am a giant film nerd, and I have a stack of Criterion DVDs about a mile high. I spent a solid decade yelling at anyone who would listen to me, why don't we have a Criterion collection for games? Game preservation matters. They exist. Criterion exists because film preservation wasn't being done adequately, and they helped solve a lot of that. I'm like, where's the game equivalent of that? And then Digital Eclipse dropped their first Goldmaster series, and I went, oh, someone's doing it. And they've consistently demonstrated how good they are at that since. Mike Mika's running that studio, and I have never met a sharper dude who understands the value of preservation more in my life. Side note, if anyone ever gets the chance, Mike Mika's office is the single greatest museum of video game stuff you'll ever see. It has everything you can imagine, but then it's the things you don't imagine that blow your mind. I'll stand in there and I will look up into the rafters and I will see stacks of Slurpee cups from 1982 that have Atari characters on them. I'm like, what am I looking at? This place is amazing. But yeah, so game preservation is so vital, and I've always been keen on playing whatever part I can in that. So yeah, now that I'm so fortunate to be in the position I'm at Commodore, I'm really keen to start helping IP holders who have classic Commodore games in their libraries, in their catalog, to help them get those games back out to the public and see what we can do and how we can help them to ensure that those games don't disappear. Right, that's really the most important thing. The number of games I love that don't exist anymore and have no way to be played other than through piracy and things like that. And like I don't besmirch people who download ROMs. I get it. It is very hard to play any of this stuff legally in 2026, but that's actually the problem. The problem isn't that they're downloading stuff, gray legally, I suppose. The problem is that there aren't legal alternatives for them, right?
Access, yeah.
Right, exactly. I know personally, if it's a choice between downloading a game I loved as a kid illegally and playing it on, oh my God, why am I forgetting the name of the thing I use? So sorry, RetroArch, right? Firing up RetroArch and playing ActRaiser or something like that. Or an ActRaiser is a terrible example because Konami still owns it, but you know what I mean. At the end of the day, I can stream any song I want on Spotify, but also if I love and support an artist, and you will see, like I have a solid collection of soundtracks here and albums and all that jazz. And yeah, it's way too many game soundtracks I'm realizing as I go through it. That's embarrassing. But that's okay. I Am 8-Bit puts out amazing stuff. I can't say no to it. That's all right. But yeah, so if I can't speak for everybody, but it does seem to me that I think most people would agree that if they can support the creators they love, they are happy to do it. And so I'm really keen, and Commodore in general is really keen to help these classic IP holders create opportunities to do that, right? Rather than folks needing to just go and download a D64 ROM or something like that. So we're doing what we can, for sure. I also think, and this is maybe me assuming too much, but I think that there is a general pushback right now, and see, this is now, okay, we're officially going to like social theory. I apologize. This is now elevating too high, but I think as a society, we are starting to see a real solid rebuff against the way the world has gone in the last 20 years. And part of that involves both art and technology. So I think that, and like for me, if I were to pinpoint a moment that tech started going the wrong way, it was probably the birth of social media. I think other people might say the internet. I think regardless, there was a time when we all grew up where the future was an exciting thing. And we look forward to that. And technology was a big part of that. We could only imagine what technology would eventually bring us. I have two kids that are both in college now. So we're talking like, well, one of them is 19 in a couple of weeks. The other one's 21. They have grown up in a post-social media age. And so they have never in their entire lives had a sense of tech optimism. They've always grown up with technology as problematic, as the villain, as greedy, as damaging. And that whole generation right now, like we're seeing it. It's so funny when you go through all of history, whenever something truly breaks, you end up seeing it sort of naturally heal. Like there's almost God, I'm getting into Taoism now. We're even going further than social theory. But yes, essentially, you know, at the end of the day, there's a natural order to things, and hopefully balance can be restored. And I think what we're seeing right now with Gen Z and Gen Alpha is we're seeing some of that balance restored. We're seeing the rejection of the way things are currently done. We're seeing a lot of these folks staying off social media or only using the messaging on social media to stay in touch with their friends. We are seeing them abandon streaming platforms. You know, I live in Toronto and I walk around every day, and at least once a day, I see someone 25 or under with a pair of corded headphones hooked up to usually like an iPod Shuffle or some other MP3 player that they're actively wearing on their body like a badge of honor, right? People are understanding the damage that technology has done, and they are trying to repair it for themselves. They're trying to find paths that are healthy and safe. And I love that. And I know Perry, our CEO, also is very, very passionate about that. This is an area we're really keen on. You know, there's a reason our tagline right now is the future we were promised, because at the end of the day, having things that are purpose-driven, technology that we use instead of technology that uses us is really, really crucial. And I think you are seeing something similar when it comes to video games themselves. So this is now the art piece, right? I think we kind of touched on it a little bit earlier. You know, this move, where the balance has shifted so far to business over art. When, you know, initially it was mobile games. It is very much AAA games now, and I'm sorry to knock that industry. And I play them and enjoy them just as much as anybody else. Mind you, a much smaller selection than I think the mainstream. But I am halfway through and very bored of Ghost of Yotai right now. So I will fully admit I will spend money on. I'll spend $100 on a game. But that industry has shifted so heavily towards business. It is about what's worked before, let's do it again, let's up the graphics, let's up the spend, and so let's figure out how we can monetize it better. It's not about what can we create that's never existed. And that's what people want. They want creativity. They want imagination. They want things that are unique and different and bespoke. They want real experiences, right? And back in the day, that's what you got in video games. A series was the exception, not the rule back then. And when you got a series, it evolved, right? Look at Mario Brothers, you know, from literally every iteration of the first four was a giant leap forward. And I am aware that 2 is a weird outlier, but it's about progress. You know, the first 3 Legend of Zelda games, right? Massive, massive progress. I'm also always going to say great things about Nintendo because to this day, they're the exception that proves every rule, as far as I'm concerned. They focus on what's new, what's interesting, what's creative. They don't care about pushing technical boundaries or spending a lot of money. And there's a reason that they continue to be top dog, right? Like they get it. Their model is the model that works. It's not the model of, you know, 17 Call of Duties a year, right? Like that's just, it's not sustainable. It doesn't make sense. The canary in the coal mine for me, and I always hope I have my facts right on this. And every time I check, it seems like I do, but now that I'm saying them on a podcast, I bet someone will catch me, and please do. I will be happy to correct myself going forward if I'm wrong. But the canary in the coal mine for me of the current form of the games industry and the AAA piece was the year, maybe it was 2022, 2021, I forget exactly which year, the year Spider-Man 2 came out, which again, banger of a game. Loved everything about Spider-Man 2, absolutely phenomenal. It was the #1 PlayStation, like first party PlayStation title of all time in terms of sales. It made more money than any other PlayStation published game had. And it ran a loss and they laid off 20% of the studio. If the most successful game you have ever put out didn't make money, we're broken. Like who's doing that anymore? Right? Where are the bean counters? If we're so obsessed with business, we're so obsessed with like the scale of money and not the realities of money, right? Are people even looking at the install base before they're making these decisions? You know, can something be recouped? Just throw money at it. It'll be a huge hit. That's what everyone keeps saying. I think the future, I think where the industry is right now, we're in a really, really fantastic moment. I liken it to a phoenix. And we were here before. This was 83 to 85, right? We're in this fantastic phoenix moment where we get to decide what the industry looks like going forward. And so the question is, are we going to let the AAA studios of the world make that decision for us? Or are we going to get out there and make the things that we believe should exist? And this is why I genuinely believe that we're at the dawn of an indie renaissance and a AA games renaissance. Helldivers 2 was a massive hit and did not have a massive budget to get there compared to other titles, right? Like this is scale matters and creativity matters. Hey, the business is still part of it, but let's start making smarter business decisions, right? The smarter business decision to me, if I had millions of dollars to invest in games, I would be saying, what is a game that people are going to remember forever, rather than what's a game that's going to make me money tomorrow, right? Think about legacy, not bottom line. And I think that retro games were very much focused on that, especially if we're talking the early Commodore scene, because we were not talking about massive, massive, massive publishers back then. So much of what we remember is bedroom coders, right? So much of what we remember is tiny stuff. We talk about Llamasoft, right? I mentioned Jeff Minter earlier. I mean, my God, go watch the documentary Heart of Neon. Like he was late teens. He was making these things. He was doing it in his bedroom, and to this day, he's still doing it from his farm. It's him and Giles. They're doing stuff together. They did not scale it. They could have, I'm sure, at some point if they wanted to. They were very successful, but they said no. We're gonna make stuff that interests us. How about this? Here's what they do. Here's what every game developer I love does, and I will say that this should be every developer's mantra. Make games you want to play, right? You know there's an audience of one, no matter what. If you are making something that would make you happy, there's definitely someone else out there who's going to like it. Whether or not there are a lot of someone else out there who's going to like it, I don't know. But the only way you find out is by making it. And I would much rather that than people looking at what's already working and throwing money at that to try to do the same thing again. And I think you're also seeing a younger generation who now, like I said, I've got kids in my 20s. These are the first kids that grew up with parents who grew up with video games, right? Like that's it. Now we're into like second generation, third generation game players, which is very, very cool. And so they get opened up to the stuff that their parents are playing, right? And they're more interested in smaller stuff, curated stuff. Like both my kids love video games, but like all they're playing right now is Tomodachi Life because it's not like anything else that's out there, right? It's different. And again, Nintendo, applaud them for doing something different. People love our stuff like Animal Crossing, games like Stardew Valley do well. They always loved the weird quirkiness of our Mii stuff. Let's bring the Tomodachi brand back to life. We only did one for the DS. To heck with it. Let's do it again. That's it. They could be sitting here playing. I'm so delighted to say I couldn't tell you what AAA title's big this week. Whatever that is, but that's of no interest. They want to find the stuff that's really unique and speaks to them personally. And so we've got to get back to treating it like an art form, right? Understanding that not every book is going to be a book everybody reads, right? You pick the books that make sense for you. You should pick the games that make sense for you. Stop trying to make things with a broad appeal that can make as much money as possible off everybody.
If the Commodore 64 was released today for the first time, would it still become a cultural icon, or is historical context part of the appeal?
That's a really good question. So if I'm going to answer, I think like the reality is everything we talked about earlier about what has made the Commodore 64 such an icon, like we can't create those moments in time, right? That was very much, it was the right product. All success in this world is about having opportunity and seizing it correctly. The opportunity was right place, right time, but we were able to deliver the product that captured that, right? That's why the Commodore 64 worked originally. I think today, if we're talking about the Commodore 64 as it exists, this classic vintage computing style experience, the Commodore 64 is great. It's a challenge. It's an era when technology used to challenge us in good, positive ways and make us smarter, not dumber, right? Listen, it's great to use Windows 11 or Mac OS, and which literally both of what I have open on my desk right now. Sorry, I have my Windows PC behind me, and I'm talking to you on my MacBook. So I'm again, pot calling the kettle black. I should be on Linux, and I know that. But the ease of these things is wonderful, but when you make things too easy, you are no longer challenging yourself in a way that is helping to evolve you as a person, right? Like we learn through hardship. And I know that's hardship is a terrible word for it, but like the reality is when I got my Commodore 64 Ultimate, I realized, oh man, I actually don't know how to control the volume on this thing because I was really enjoying the onboard sound. Like I know I could hook it up to, my TV to get sound and all that, but I dig the onboard sound on this thing. And I'm like, I have no idea how to adjust the volume. And it honestly took me 15 minutes of fiddling in the menus, and I felt like I'd accomplished something. I'm like, oh, there's the dopamine hit of doing something and learning something, and it was literally just adjusting volume on this thing, right? So I think that we have lost the ability to learn that, well, we had an opportunity to learn things in a way that we don't anymore. And I think that needs to come back. I think that has been a lot of the reason we find struggle is because we are not forced to develop critical thinking in the way that we used to be.
You need to come back so we can have a comprehensive discussion about the ontology of video games and get really, really deep and talk about all the social theory and all of the business side, but the art side and all of the fuzzy intersections.
God, I would love that. I would
We
love it
need
so
to do
much.
this.
Oh, I would love that. I would love that. Well, I'll tell you, yes, please. And I have so many stories, and I have to figure out which ones I'm actually able to tell. But yes, yeah, I would absolutely love that. But yeah, I mean, the very short version of the answer to your question, I'll actually try to answer this one quickly. Um, I think that if the Commodore 64 did not exist and it came out today, I think it would be very successful as a cottage industry product. I think that there are people who are craving this sort of an experience. I think if there was like a new vintage computer that dropped that offered this kind of experience that people hadn't had before, I think there are people that would really appeal to. But it would be like a small scale success. It would be a lowercase c Commodore success as opposed to an uppercase C. Which, by the way, uppercase C Commodore success. Just noting, if you didn't grow up on the bread bin Commodore, last week we did announce we're doing the Commodore 64C Ultimate. It's coming out later this year. It's open for pre-order, so I got to throw that out there. I would not be doing my job if I didn't. So with the C64C, we actually acquired the original tooling that was used in 1986 to make the molds. So the molds for the new one are being made with the exact same tooling from 1986, and we have footage from when Perry went and toured the factory and inspected the moldings and all that. It's very cool stuff.
Where can listeners go to learn more about the Commodore 64 Ultimate?
Oh, what a wonderful question. The short answer is Commodore.net. Come join us. Yeah, you can pre-order your Commodore 64C Ultimate. You can buy your Commodore 64 Ultimate. We've got lots of fun merch and accessories and adapters and all the jazz that you would ever want, and it's growing. We actually, if you visit the website today, and you visited it even 3 weeks ago, you will be in for a wonderful treat. We just launched our new website. I know that's such a silly thing to get excited about, but honestly, it looks great, it feels great, it runs great. So yeah, come on over, take a peek, and it's also going to give us a lot of flexibility to do fun new things as time goes on. So keep an eye out. We have things in the works. It'll be good times.
Today, we are honored to be interviewing a very special guest, Pauli Kidd, whose work, if not name, will be familiar to many of you.
Pauli Kidd is a transgender woman who's been a full-time creative legend for 42 years. Her work runs through film, literature, comic books, and games of all varieties. Pauli is a pioneer of game design with many titles under her belt, including The Lord of the Rings, Discworld 1 and 2, Nightshade, Shadowrun, Samurai Warrior, The Battles of Usagi Yojimbo, and countless others.
Pauli has 40+ novels in print, including key novels for Dungeons & Dragons. Her books are part of the US Library of Congress's permanent collection, and her historical miniatures games can be found in every wargame shop.
Pauli runs a YouTube channel, Lace and Steel, which covers transgender history, tabletop gaming, and transgender topics. She's an active advocate for transgender, disabled, and LGBTQ+ rights, in addition to being an expert fencer, martial artist, belly dancer, and burlesque performer. Something of a celebrity in science fiction and gaming circles, Pauli is a frequent guest at conventions and on podcasts, now including this one. Pauli, welcome to the Microprose podcast.
Hi, nice to be here.
What first drew you into the world of game development?
When I got to high school, I went to this wonderful hippie bush high school in Victoria, era school. And on day one, as I was roaming about the library, I found the purple primer. It was the Airfix book of ancient war games, and they had all these Airfix books on wargaming with miniature figures. And I started avidly reading these and fell in love with wargaming. The books written by those key games at the time, they were people like Phil Barker, Donald Featherston, Charles Grant. You could go to a library and find these, and what I loved about them, and I've done reviews of these on my channel, is that these guys loved gaming and they wanted that love to communicate across to you through their books. And it worked. As you were reading them, these people were so passionate and so very good at communicating that love that, yeah, you were in there and playing. So I joined a War Games club at the tender age of about 12. And it was a really interesting society to join because as a kid, adults would just accept you. You're one of the group. You were valued. You were seen as one of the others. And your opinions were as valid as an adult's because you're particularly as a strange, intense, highly read, somewhere on the spectrum kid. Yeah, you knew as much as many adults did. But when role-playing games, when Dungeons and Dragons was first created, it appeared in those clubs. So these were the people that were sitting down and playing it. So, I was sort of one of the first people playing Dungeons and Dragons, and I fell passionately in love with role-playing games. I still remember those first games just vividly. But what I had done as this kind of enthusiastic kid, I had really wanted to be an author and was kind of striving to be so. But this love of games, I had caught it. So I wrote to these creators, both the war games and the role-playing games ones, and told them, look, I'm a kid. I am going to be a science fiction and fantasy author, but I want to do games. I just wanted to tell you how much your work has lit up my world. And what was lovely is these people wrote back and they encouraged me and said, go for it. Never let anyone tell you no. Yeah, here's the things that you might want to go on and study at university. And that encouragement just pushed me onwards. And I stayed in correspondence with a lot of these people for decades, until they died. And they were a huge encouragement to a kid to like get out there, study those courses, and just do it. So yeah, that was sort of how I came to it. And I had been involved with some very basic early computer programming stuff at university. This is the 70s we're talking about, where some of the computers were assembled by literally banging bits of circuitry onto planks of wood. I kid you not. But yeah, and yeah, you had to write your programs on punch cards. But when I was at university, I organized war games clubs, and I became very key in organizing some of the first role-playing game conventions in Australia, and met all my fellow gamers and so on. But I became a bit more interested in computer games as well. And of course, now I'm actually hanging out with computer sciences people. So I was never going to be a computer programmer. My mind does not work that way. But by knowing so many people in that world, I sort of got to know what they need, what makes their job better, um, how to communicate to the people from that end of the alphabet. So yeah, after university, as I was getting my first physical kind of print games out, there was a company called Melbourne House in Melbourne who had established themselves doing some games like Horace Goes Skiing and so on. Some true classics there, ladies and gentlemen. And they were doing things for the emergent home computers like the Spectrum and the Amstrads and the C64s and so on, that were just brand spanking new inventions. So they hired me. I came in because they had decided at that time that they needed a games designer, because at that stage all computer games were done entirely by programmers. You were the person that did it all. And what was happening was these guys were very good at coaxing these incredibly primitive, very small memory machines into doing some amazing stuff. But game design, that larger picture, that wasn't what they did. So I was brought in to be the person that could do that, have the larger picture, be the mind that did that sort of thing. So I started off freelancing for them for a couple of titles. God, what was the first one? There was a couple of sort of bootlegging in the 1920s kind of games I did for them. And then I asked me to do a thing called Maces and Magic, which was like a choose your own adventure thing. And then they decided they needed someone full time. And so I started off with the Lord of the Rings text adventures,
No pressure, though.
doing
Yeah.
dialogue and everything. And then, yeah, then, I continued to work for them then from like the mid 80s to probably about 1993, I guess. And somewhere in there, Nintendos and so on are invented, and console games became a thing as well. So I did the first Nintendo games done outside of Japan and so on as well. So, and was meanwhile getting my own pen and pencil, tabletop games out as well. So yeah, it was just a strange feed into a creative life of gaming and trying to get novels out. So yeah, so I kind of fell into the Melbourne House thing. It was interesting because when they were advertising for a game designer, it's like I was it in the country. This is it. Do you want someone who can
Wow.
design games, who knows board games and role-playing games and war games, and can also work with the computer guys. So it's pretty much me.
Perfect.
I, I'm it. Primitive days, ladies and gentlemen, primitive days. And a
Yeah.
lot of the programmers at that time, that company was actually, they were hiring young people because these were skills that they didn't exist. So it was only people kind of just starting to come out of university that actually had these programming and skills at the time. So they were very young companies.
What
But
did
yeah,
development actually feel like day to day in the 80s and 90s?
it's pretty weird actually because I sort of saw my job as two things. One was they have work that they want done. And the other half was I come up with ideas that I then pitch to them and say, let's do this as a company. And a lot of the stuff that they wanted done, they would do things like get the license to The Lord of the Rings and decide that they had some basic programming ideas of how that would be done. So they would come to me and then say, cook something up and make it work in this sort of way. So yeah, you'd end up, it was essentially paper and pencil work. You would sit there scribbling out different ideas and seeing if they worked, and then having to sit down with programmers. And in many cases, we're having to invent these processes. So you're sitting down with people and say, look, is it too much to ask that you come up with a system that does this? And you get some hard looks and people, yeah, actually, no, that's a cool idea. We'll get back to you. Hang on, we're going to have a mess and see if we can actually make the machines do the things you're talking about. So there was a lot of to and fro and a lot of inventing the basic tools to make the program. These guys were very clever at it too, because there was so little memory in those computers.
What were some of the biggest technical limitations developers had to work around back then?
A huge part of it was just the memory in the machines. You were often having to make things for a cassette drive. So you had programming that could go, obviously onto the cassette, but the memory in the machine, the hard memory, the ROM, was pretty damn limited. So they were having to work with ways of swapping memory out, but you didn't want to keep going back to that taped memory or later on disk memory because it's slow and it breaks down the gaming process. So that limitation was hard because that really hurt graphics and movement. And so, like we're saying, this guy's got devilishly cunning. So we had to sit down one day, and these guys invented parallax scrolling. And essentially, it was a way of fooling the computer so that you could have sections of background moving at different speeds so that you got a fake perspective looking into a computer. And that was done by realizing that the thing could change characters faster than the eye normally records. So you couldn't really split up different areas of the screen into giving it different scrolling um, orders. But what you could do is flicker quickly between different graphics so that you could make the illusion of, perspective and this parallax scrolling. And yeah, but the amount of work that has to go into doing that tiny thing. And there'd be like decisions where like they're trying to figure out, we're doing one of the first point and click adventure games. Actually, it was in Discworld, and we needed they couldn't figure out how do we make this character move into the distance without having these ridiculous artificial shifts where suddenly it gets smaller in front of your eyes, clicking downwards. And, I have to sit there and say, oh, easy. It's going to be done with terrain. We're going to have pieces of masking terrain. The character goes behind that. When they come out, they're smaller and they're heading into the next section. So he walks behind those trees. Now he's on the road slightly smaller, goes over the hill, pops out on the next hill slightly smaller. We do it that way. So yeah, there were these kind of conceptual ideas you had to mess with because the hardware couldn't handle a lot at the time.
Were there any ideas or features you ever wanted to include in a game that weren't possible due to those hardware limitations or production constraints of any kind?
Oh God, yes. I really wanted to do first person point of view games, which are common now, but the screens were really not capable of updating themselves in a time that made a game that was going to be graphically pleasing. They would be very flat, horrible graphics, and it would be very clunky shifts. So the hardware just wasn't at the stage where we could do first-person shooters and first-person viewpoint. I wanted to do exploration games, space exploration games, horror. So a lot of those things, they just had to wait for a later generation of computers, really. And there were many games that I wanted to be bigger or to have sub games in them, sub pathways you go into. And in the end, there was just no way of honestly fitting them into the sort of memory we had to work with. So you had to regretfully let them go.
And do you have any other memorable behind the scenes stories from developing games in the C64 period that audiences today would find surprising?
Actually, the C64 was a bit of a honey to work with. It was relatively easy to program compared to the others. The Asaki Yojimbo, the clouds floating past in the background. One of them was a reclining naked woman, and we never saw it. The artist put it in as his little gag. But working tightly on a thing, yeah, clouds going past looks good. That's fantastic. And it was only when you took a step back and we're looking at it, you realize, oh God, it's a reclining nude. But we didn't kind of realize that until people played the game and wrote back and said, oh, we like the secret hidden nude lady. There's a what? Yeah. Everyone gathers around the screen.
Well, how did the Usagi Yojimbo game come about?
Through the course of this, there are people from so many different backgrounds. I'm wargaming, as I said, and role-playing games, but there was a particular programmer, Doug Palmer, lovely guy, English guy, completely crazy, shaven-headed, definite punk vibes there. But he was a big comic book fan, and I would sometimes head into the city with him on the way home and so on. And he would always stop off at the big old comic store, and he's trying to get his bucket loads of X-Men and Batman and God knows what. In the late 80s and early 90s, there's some fantastic talents, and there were people who were self-publishing things. And there was one particular title called Albedo. And Albedo was a hard science fiction story, but it used animal characters, humanoid animal characters. And I sort of opened this up, and this was just rivetingly good sci-fi, really well written, and the artwork was fantastic. So I actually ended up doing the first paper and pen kind of role-playing game published in Australia was actually the Albedo role-playing game. I did the role-playing game, and I used the comic as a basis. But this guy would publish short stories from up-and-coming artists in the back of each copy of Albedo, and that first kind of one that I picked up, it had a story in the back by a guy called Stan Sakai. And Stan had done like a samurai story, also using animal characters. And it was very, very well done. I was a huge samurai fan and remain so. That's one of the miniatures games I've put out most recently are samurai battle games, because Helion, one of the big name history publishers who also does games over in the UK, have declared me to be one of the world's top authorities on Japanese medieval history. So I loved Stan's stuff. And then Stan went on and did his own title by the publisher Fantagraphics, Usagi Yojimbo. And it's a really good comic. I love his work. He is riffing off the serialized Japanese samurai movies from sort of the 60s and 70s. So things like Zato Ichi and the classic Toshiro Mifune samurai movies like Yojimbo and so on. So this character is about a wandering sort of Ronin samurai, and he's solving problems, encountering mystical creatures. And as was my one, I started corresponding with Stan, and we became friends. So I actually thought, I reckon we could do a game on this. So I wrote something up and pitched it to management and said, look, I could do this. Oh, we'd never get the IP rights to do this. Well, of course we can. This guy's a personal friend. So I put the company in touch with Stan and then took my hands off. That's not my business then. You guys sort it out, and if you do, you do. But they sorted out something, so we came back and we began work on Usagi Yojimbo. Doug Palmer ended up as the programmer, which is good because he's a comic fan. So this is purity and love for Doug. And we got to work trying to do something that was absolutely definitely not a side view platform game. And so we we're trying to get some very Japanesey concepts into it from the outset. So you have like karma, and as you do good and decent things, you know, beat up evil people, fight monsters, you gain positive karma. But if you do stupid things like, you know, kill random peasants, you lose it. And we had some cute concepts like things disguising themselves. So I had a friend who was playtesting. Oh, actually, again, one of the people I'm sharing a house with, they said, yeah, I played that. I was outraged because I'm walking through this field and there's just these peasants kind of chopping away in the fields, and there's merchants that pass you on the road. There's ordinary life happening in the game. So, but a couple of the people on the road sort of stop up ahead of me and are talking, and some of the peasants just in the natural tilling are getting closer. And suddenly I realize I'm kind of surrounded by these guys, at which point they all throw off their clothes and they're actually ninja and attack. It's like, I walked straight into that. Nothing seemed suspicious about every NPC on the screen just idling in my direction.
How do you feel about the current resurgence of interest in retro gaming and hardware coming out like this Commodore 64 Ultimate?
So much love and effort went into those early games and so much invention. It may not look it to modern eyes, but the amount of clever thinking going on to make those games happen on those platforms. I'm glad that that's surviving and that people sort of see, although they don't have the flashy graphics of, you know, modern computers, they have a charm, and I like that charm is still appreciated. So it's good to see them back, and it's good to see, just that interest in retro gaming. I love going to conventions where there's retro gaming going on. It's like you made something that's still making people happy, and that's a reward.
Do you think classic games should be preserved exactly as they were, or is there room for respectful remasters?
Yeah, I I like seeing the originals preserved. I'd kind of almost like it side by side. I'd like people to be able to see what we originally did. It would be nice to see like a reimagining of these, a remastering. However, what I keep seeing when they do that is they never involve anyone that was on the original projects. So I think reimaging is only really, really good if it's somehow a continuity of that creative team. Like, this is what you guys would have done if you could, would be kind of a nice thing to see as a game. So I'd love to see more come out involving the old creative teams, you know, even just one or two people. Something like Usagi Yojimbo, like that was one where we had to let a lot of the game go because it was one where there was supposed to be many different side realms to explore, a more complex gameplay that was going to have many multiple choices of pathway, and we just couldn't do it. The memory of the machine just couldn't handle it.
Pauli, thank you so much for your time today and all the best with your many adventures. Where can people find you online?
I have a YouTube channel called Lace and Steel where I do game reviews and also a lot of transgender history and so on, sort of as a sideline of the channel. And I'm on Facebook. But yeah, YouTube is the easiest place to sort of find me online.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Our next featured guest is Andy Roberts, a veteran game developer and journalist with over 35 years industry experience. Cutting his teeth on the legendary Commodore 64 magazine Zap 64 in the late 80s, he went on to write for dozens of UK magazines, including Commodore Format, Total, and PC Format. As a game developer, Andy worked on numerous best-selling Commodore 64 games, including Creatures, Creatures 2, and Mayhem in Monsterland. In the mid-90s, he worked for Sony Europe during the launch of the PS1, before moving to Acclaim Entertainment to work on revered titles such as Forsaken and Shadow Man. Andy later went on to work for numerous studios in a variety of roles, including Other Ocean Interactive, where he was lead designer on South Park: Tenenbaum's Revenge. Very cool, by the way. In 2017, Andy founded Thalamus Digital, which has developed and published over 50 indie and retro games over the last 10 years. He is also the founder of Rocket Books, a publisher dedicated to video game related books and magazines, and he is here with us today, for which we are very grateful.
Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks for joining us. So first off, can you tell us a bit about yourself and, of course, Thalamus?
I mean, the introduction sort of gives you a potted history. I mean, I've been in the video game industry professionally now, this is my 37th year, which doesn't even sound real when you say it back. Started off very much, writing for magazines and that kind of thing, and sort of found my way into sort of a freelance journalistic career. And then at the same time got interested in game development during the sort of the bedroom coder era where people basically made games in their bedrooms. And then from there, just managed to sort of make my way into the industry, worked for a few big companies professionally and whatnot. And yeah, I mean, I've done a variety of different roles within the industry. I've been a programmer, a designer, a producer, an artist. I think the only thing I haven't really done is music within the industry. And Thalamus is really, I started it about 2017, so about 9 years ago, just to scratch a creative itch that I had. I wanted to run a Kickstarter and remaster an old Commodore 64 game. And at that time, sort of retro seemed to be coming back. So I thought, well, maybe I can get involved here. And, my day job per se is working in sort of mobile games. But it's a very sort of, it's a single track sort of industry, and it's very much the same sort of thing. So Thalamus allows me to do all the other things that I'm interested in, whether that's retro games or indie games or console games or that kind of, anything that I would like to try. I basically do it through Thalamus because nobody can stop me. Basically.
It's an itch and then a rash that just spread.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Hopefully contagious. It seems fitting that you've resurrected the Thalamus name, considering your pre-existing ties and the fact that both you and Thalamus can both trace your roots back to gaming magazines. But it kind of makes me wonder, like, what's your one true love out of writing, game design, art, publishing, all of the things, or do you love them all equally?
Yeah, I don't think I could pick one, and I think that's why I've worked on so many different things. In so many different jobs, because I physically can't stick to one. They all have their upsides, their downsides, but it's really just, I think anything creative, it's just, if you're a creative person, the world is just like a buffet, right? And you just think, oh, I'll have some of that and some of that. So I couldn't pick a favorite. I really
That's
couldn't.
fair.
You've witnessed several decades of gaming evolution. Are there any changes or trajectories that have surprised you?
It's a really interesting question because there's been so much. It's really hard to sort of pin it down to a specific thing. The biggest one is really the emergence and I suppose the endurance of the indie game scene. Back in the day when I first started making games, there were people who would program games in their bedrooms and they'd put a classified ad in a magazine, say you can buy, and they'd manufacture copies themselves and that kind of thing. But they were very, very niche and very, very small, and they were very much outside of the industry. But slowly but surely, indie games have now, they're just as important, just as relevant as AAA games or, bigger games from big studios. They can generate significant revenue, as we've seen, and they're equally as valid and impactful and meaningful. And I think they've really done the industry a service in terms of really expanding the medium, the scope of the medium, and bending the genres and showing people that a game doesn't necessarily have to be, a set formula. It can be something, there are so many indie games which are just incredibly inventive. And you look at them and you think, is that a game? Is it an interactive experience? You know, you've got these indie games that just defy genre, and they're greater than the sum of their parts, and you know, just incredibly inventive ideas that really take you in a different direction. And I think I've had some of the most emotional experiences I've had with games have been with indie games, and it's really endearing to see how somebody somewhere has not only a crazy idea that they think people are going to connect with, but they also have the diligence to sit down and make it against huge odds, whether that's financially supporting themselves and or just getting the game out there and getting it into a wider audience. So whenever there's an indie game that comes out where it just goes into the stratosphere and, you know, the creator becomes an instant millionaire and all that kind of stuff, I really try and cheer those people on, because it's not really the monetary success. It's a lot of it is just the validation. You know, at the end of that journey, you know, people are buying this game and they click with it and they resonate with it. But yeah, there's been some tremendous indie games over the last 10, 15 years, like incredible experiences that just, as a game creator, they force you to sit up and take notice and say to yourself, I need to start thinking outside the box. I need to sort of, you know, stop, you know, following patterns and try and, you know, think about something that I would like to make and the audience who would connect with that.
That's a good answer, and completely agree with you about indie games. So, tangenting a little bit, because I can't help myself, I listened to your interview on the Retro Hour podcast from a couple of months ago, which was very interesting, by the way. So, if anyone's listening to this and enjoying Andy's interview, definitely check it out. But anyway, it seems like your personal interest in gaming can be traced back to a childhood Christmas Commodore. So, I was wondering, how much have your childhood hobbies influenced your adult career, and should parents stop limiting screen time? That's a little tongue in cheek, but also is deadly serious.
It's a really good question. I mean, I suppose it was very different when I was growing up, because we had one television and that was in the living room and everybody shared that. So being able to plug in the computer and use that television to program or create or play games, it can only be done at certain times. And when my dad came home from work and he put the news on, that was it. The TV was his for the night. So it was a very different era then. You know, the screens as we know it didn't really exist in that way. I mean, to answer the first part, I think very much me being a creative child very much led into what I do to this day. I don't think I could have done a normal job. I mean, I have done normal jobs. I mean, working in the games industry can be quite hard at times. Sometimes, you know, if you're between jobs or stuff like that, you know, you just have to work. And I've done a variety of different jobs in the real world. And thankfully I was brought up to sort of never turn your nose up to anything. Like you know, you're not above, you know, getting on your hands and knees and cleaning a toilet or using a shovel to dig a hole, that kind of thing. But very much like, you know, I was very artistic and I used to draw a lot as a child. And I had, you know, ADHD, so I couldn't really focus on the mundane. I was very much distracted by shiny things, and I would go wherever my attention, you know, my attention would go somewhere, and I would, you know, dutifully follow it. So I think certainly I really wanted to do something that was creative from a young age. I think my parents tried to steer me towards computers and computer programming, you know, towards maybe like an IT sort of job. But when I thought about computers, I thought about creativity and graphic design and you know, anything but IT. I think spending time with a computer or you know, some kind of creative endeavor on the computer, I think is very different to general screen time. I think if you cut out social media, then fine, give your kids a way to sort of learn how to program and learn about technology and that kind of thing.
Mm.
I suppose there would really have to be a balance, but I'm really biased because I love being creative. But if your child shows some sort of creative urge, I think you should 100% sort of encourage that and see where it leads. And it may lead nowhere, but then that might be a jumping off point to something that they do enjoy, that they can excel at. And
Yeah.
I certainly think in the modern day, with the advent of generative AI and things like that, I think the arts and human based creativity, I think, is more important than ever.
I 100% agree with you that it's important to encourage kids to use technology to enhance their creativity rather than block them from accessing it in some attempt to force them to be creative instead.
And associate it with the fun that, there's the problem solving aspect, there's, the reward system, of course, but, there are so many other angles to games other than, simply just that dopamine that everyone thinks, get them off the screen, go outside.
The process of creating a game, it's not just you and a computer screen constantly. There are, within any given day, I may have to get out some paper and a pen and work things out that way. Sometimes you just got to step back from the technology and do that. So when I was a kid, if I couldn't use the computer on the TV in the living room at home, I would be drawing stuff on paper. I would be writing notes and designing things on paper. So limiting that technology is not necessarily a bad thing, because it forces your brain to work in different ways. And obviously drawing things with a pen is very different than handwriting notes. It's a very different activity for the brain.
And the digital game space is great because it incorporates all of the art forms and combines them into one mega art form. Like, you can't get much better than that, honestly.
And looking back over your life, were there any other moments or decisions that set you on the path, or did it just kind of happen?
When I look back, it's usually I pursued one thing and I thought, okay, let's try and make this thing happen. And then eventually that would lead to, there would come another point in my life where I'd pivot again and say, okay, I've done that. Here's another opportunity. Let's go after that. And it was really just chasing things that interested me, saying yes to a lot of things that I wasn't really sure about at the time. So I was lucky enough to be offered various opportunities along the way. And one of the things that I discovered was just say yes, and figure it out later on, or figure it out as you go along. Sometimes I was a deer in the headlights and I was too scared to say no. So I just sort of said yes anyway. But I think it was really just a series of, I just leapfrogged basically from, one opportunity to another. And when I started working for magazines professionally, obviously there was a lot more contact with game developers, and that sort of opened up the scope of, well, I found out more about how games were made, and then that was, another path that I then became interested in. So it was really just a case of these things sort of popped up along the way. Had I not pursued one, I mean, you could trace it all back to a single decision. If I said to myself, I don't want to write for a computer games magazine, I'll go and work for the city instead, processing, property tax bills. That would have pretty much, I wouldn't be sitting here talking to you. But it was really just a case of, I really want to write. This is my favorite computer magazine. I really want to write for this magazine. How can I make this happen? And even my headmaster at school, he encouraged me. He said, if that's what you want to do, then go for it. If that's, because he was just happy to see someone who was passionate about something. And I think that's the key thing, is find something that you're really passionate about. And not just in terms of, I could build a career, or I could make a lot of money, or any of that kind of stuff. If it lights that fire in your belly, that's more important than anything else, because it's that passion that's going to carry you through, the ups and downs of working in, a creative industry.
On behalf of the world, thank you for following your passions and not working for the council.
Yeah, I don't think I could do that. It was, we visited the council offices, and there was a guy in a basement, and it was all strip lighting, and he was on his own, hunched over a console, processing bills. And I just instantly at that moment, that was a pivotal moment in my life. It was, I cannot do that. As exciting as this job sounds in terms of career prospects and stability, I cannot be that guy. I have to do something else. And then within a year, fast forward a year from that point, I was, working professionally for a video game magazine.
Living the dream.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
This episode is kind of about dreams, I guess, because it's about gaming. But specifically, this episode centers around nostalgia, retro gaming, gaming history, all of that stuff. And people often talk about nostalgia as a longing for the past. But what do you think we're really nostalgic for when we revisit old games?
Now, this is an amazing question because just a couple of days ago, I watched a clip of a scene from the show Mad Men. And there's a scene in that where Don Draper pitches an idea to Kodak. And basically, there's a slide projector that has a little sort of wheel on it with all the slides. And it's called the carousel scene, if anyone wants to look it up. But it is one of the best scenes in Mad Men, is one of the best scenes in TV of the last 20 years. And he talks about nostalgia there. And he talks about how the origin of the word nostalgia in Greek basically refers to the pain from an old wound. And in the scene, they tie it up perfectly when they talk about nostalgia being this twinge of pain, because you long to go back to the past. And that's what it does. It's you long to go back to this point where you felt loved or safe or protected or carefree. And the way that, a lot of people do as kids, you think about Christmas from the past, and, they can be these warm, cozy times. And I think partly when we get those nostalgic sort of pangs for old games, I think a lot of it stems from exactly that, like taking us back to how we felt, and that point in our lives when we played those games. It's not necessarily about the games, because a lot of old games, to be blunt, are quite terrible. They don't really hold up these days. Even some of the classics, there are some games that I loved, dearly loved as a kid, but I wouldn't be able to go back and play them to the same extent that I did back then. But I think a lot of it is really, you're not nostalgic about the game. You're nostalgic about who you were as a person when you first played that game, what your life was like at that time, or how that game made you feel. I think it's a mixture of things, but it's not just the game itself. I think when you see like an old game, you're scrolling online or something, or you remember an old game that you used to play, I think that sets off a chain reaction of so many different things within you. And I think music can do the same thing. Sometimes smells can do the same thing. I think nostalgia is great because it is sort of like a time machine. But it can also have its downsides too, when you go back and look at the past and look at games you used to play and think, oh, I used to play that. But yeah, I think it has its uses, and I think it has its place. And certainly, I listen to a lot of music during the day when I'm working, and certainly there are moments where you remember an old album or something that you used to listen to, and it's sort of like sometimes I'll say, oh, right, I'll play that right now. Sometimes I'll write it down and choose to go back to that time when I want to feel a particular way.
Totally get that. Many modern games deliberately evoke retro aesthetics. What separates meaningful nostalgia from simple imitation?
Again, another really good question. I think it falls into maybe two categories. So sometimes it's an aesthetic choice, and someone says, I just want to make a game that looks like a pixel art game or looks like a retro game. or it's a simplistic enough art style that it can be learned a lot quicker than 3D art or something like that. So sometimes you'll have a solo developer who thinks, well, maybe pixel art will be faster for me to do. And it's a look that is simplistic and it suits the gameplay. And I think an example of that would be something like Stardew Valley, where it has a retro sort of pixel art look, but the game doesn't necessarily have to look like that. It wouldn't really make a difference, to the actual core experience. I think the other sort of aspect to that are sort of times when that aesthetic really complements the game's mechanics and sensibilities. And a really good example of this is a game called Mina the Hollower, which came out this week, and it tries to emulate the Game Boy Color, and they've approached the development of the game like you look at it and in a screenshot it could be a Game Boy Color game because they've used the same color palette, the same restrictions, that kind of thing, and that's a much that goes much deeper than an aesthetic choice, because the Game Boy Color sort of look and feel is also prevalent there. So I think you've got two sort of different camps, but I think at the end of the day, as long as it evokes the right feeling from the player, I think both sort of have an equal place.
Speaking of retro games, how important is game preservation? And do you think we, as a society or an industry, are doing enough to protect gaming history?
I think it's very important, especially given, from my perspective anyway, how hard people work on them. So, you've got these, especially with bigger games for bigger studios, you've got folks who can be working on games for many years. And, during that time, people get married, people get divorced, people have kids, you see a whole sort of different range of sort of life changes over the course of making these games that they become embedded in your life. There was a period where, when I was working for Acclaim particularly, you didn't think in terms of years or life events, you thought in terms of projects. Oh, that was during that project. They became sort of huge sort of milestones in your career and your personal life, and there's so much invested in them. And then yet 2 years later, that game could be gone for good, completely gone. And it's kind of tragic that happens. Not just that the game is lost, but there's no way for the creators to sort of return to it easily. And you've just got these amazing games that are lost in time, basically. And I do like the fact that you have, there's a lot of websites and places out there who are, trying to preserve digital history. And you've got websites like Good Old Games, where their focus is on giving these games a place that they can sort of rest, that be the final resting place for that particular game. And it is tricky because, you've got various games and intellectual properties. They still have commercial value, or they still have to be commercially defended by the company who owns them. So I think it's very tricky in terms of how it would be handled, how it should be handled. I mean, certainly there is the technology out there. Every single Game Boy game, for example, could be made available digitally, but Nintendo won't do that. And so you've got this whole raft of games out there which can only be played on an emulator or on real hardware if you've got the cartridge. But they're no longer commercially viable. I mean, a few games filter through onto the Nintendo Switch, but there's a whole legacy of games there just for that platform alone, which modern audiences don't have a way to tap into. The way that I handle it through Thalamus is some of Thalamus's old games. I put them up online, and it's literally $1, which is the lowest amount that you can charge on that particular website, and it's just $1. They're up there, they're preserved. There's scans and all kinds of stuff that you can download too. So it's up there, and if you want to pay some money for it, that money will go to the original creator of that game. and it's sort of that's the closest balance that I can find. But I think it needs to be more standardized. Like I say, there's a lot of places out there, different organizations doing great work in terms of preservation, but you've got, a place over here in Europe, you've got a place over here in Los Angeles. It's very disconnected, and you've got multiple people doing the same thing. And I think there has to be a better way, and I think there has to be more cooperation as well from, the bigger companies like Sony and Nintendo and Microsoft. I mean, case in point would be, you mentioned earlier on South Park Teneman's Revenge, which I worked on. There was no physical copy of that. It was a digital download. So I have an old Xbox 360 and the game is on that. But that's the only way that I can play that game now, is on that console. And I can't sit there and play it. The console's getting older. I don't even know if I booted up the console, would it still boot up? So my hope is that it's still on there. But there's literally no other way to play that game. That's completely gone. But conversely, I worked at Acclaim on a game called Shadow Man, and there's now a version of Shadow Man remastered on Steam, so I can play that game anytime. So it's sort of it's a double-edged sword. But I certainly think as well that there's an incredible legacy there that's just interesting to people to play as research that they will never get to see and experience. If you like, if you're a fan of, if a kid was interested in being a filmmaker, well, you can go back and easily look at old movies and films and TV and things like that. If you're a musician, if you wanted to go back, step back in time, it's fairly straightforward to do that. But with video games, there's a level of complexity to it that makes it even more difficult.
If you could ensure one piece of gaming history was preserved forever, what would it be?
Now, this is the one that I would find impossible to answer, because I think it's all important in its own way. And, especially the way the games industry works. I mean, when you read interviews with other creators and things like that, they could have been inspired by, a specific game at a specific time. And I think, there's so many different generations of people now working on video games that all got inspired by different things. So I think I couldn't really just pick one. It would be incredibly difficult. I think it's all so incredibly intermeshed and interconnected.
That is so fair.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, in that case then, are there any games, developers, lessons, or stories from the early days that you would like to not be forgotten?
Again, I think as much of it as possible, really. And it's a shame that, I mean, in this sort of age, there's a plethora of stories being told, documentaries being made, books being written. And I part of me sort of wishes that back in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, more of that, was happening. More of that was being documented, because I think there's thousands of stories, good and bad, waiting to be told. I mean, certainly from my own personal experience, just the experience I've had at various companies and things like that, I could sit here for 10 hours and just reel off stories. Some of them probably scandalous or libelous, but the path through the games industry is quite. There's no 2 days are ever the same, and I think once you have so many people together working on a project, on a creative endeavor, and all trying to push in the same direction, and all of those people, none of those people are having the same day every day. There's clashes, there's egos, there's arguments. I've had doors slammed in my face by artists who didn't want to do another revision of things. But there's also so many highs to go with the lows and triumphs, and breaking through barriers, and when the game comes to life and it finally has a soul and things like that. Just there are thousands of stories out there, and I think like I say, I wish more of it had been documented, because I think even the simplest game, the quote unquote simplest looking games, they often have really interesting backstories. And so many sort of nuances to that story, and like I say, incredible highs, incredible lows. So my plea to sort of to game developers and whatnot would be document more of your process, blog a lot more, talk a lot more about the process, because you'll want to remember that stuff in years to come when you look back. And you never know who you're going to inspire, especially in terms of there might be someone going through the same adversity that you went through on a project, and just reading about how you managed to come out on the other side might inspire them to finish a game that they otherwise might not be able to finish. But yeah, there's a lot of history that's still unwritten.
Which game from the classic or recent Thalamus catalog do you think deserves more recognition?
Well, I mean, Creatures had it's probably one of the most popular, but I mean, certainly a lot of the games that I've published, with Thalamus in the last, 9 years, particularly the last 5 years, some really, really interesting indie games, especially on the Switch. Like I would say, if you're interested in recent Thalamus games, a lot of the stuff that we've put out on Switch is really sort of eclectic and interesting. But the one that I really think probably deserves more recognition is a game called Welcome to Basingstoke, which we released last year, which was a PS5 game. And it was out on PC. It was a game written by a team called Puppy Games. And I had the idea to sort of bring it to PlayStation 5. And oh my goodness, it really hit a sweet spot for me, because it's an incredibly British game, has an incredibly British sense of humor. Post-apocalyptic game. You basically pick a character and you've got to escape from this English suburban town of Basingstoke, and you collect things and you craft them together and make weapons and all kinds of other items. And it's so wonderfully charming. Like when I first saw the game, it really enamored me. And that's what drove me on. It was sort of like I really think that people will click with this and resonate with this. But obviously on things like the PlayStation 5, it's very difficult for indies these days to make a big splash on the consoles. So I don't think it ever really sort of reached the audience that it should have. So that would be my suggestion, really. I'd really love to see that game pick up a wider audience, because it's funny and it's tense and it's stealthy and it's crafty, and there are roguelike elements, and yeah, it was one of those games that I really, really loved the first time I saw it.
Well, we will be sure to put the link to that in the show notes. So if you're listening, go and pay attention to that game, because it'll be worth your while. Seeing as this is the Microprose podcast, I probably should ask, are there any Microprose titles, past or present, that really stand out to you or that you have a particular fondness for?
Yeah, so I was a Commodore 64 fanboy through and through. And so Microprose in those days, they released a lot of really good simulations. So they had a couple of games, one called Gunship, and one called Project Stealth Fighter. And both of those games were, I mean, they were incredibly complicated, really big, thick manual, as any flight simulator would be. But such an incredible intro sequences, generated a really, really amazing atmosphere. And they were games that you could really get engrossed in for hours at a time, because you're pretty much sort of flying to places in real time. So it could take you half an hour to actually get to the enemy base before you could do anything. On the Commodore 64 particularly, there was a game called Microprose Soccer, which was written by a team called Sensible Software, which is probably one of the best football games for any of the 8-bit machines. And the final one would be a game called Stunt Car Racer. And I think I played that on the Amiga computer. And it was brilliant, not only in the way that it was crafted, but you could actually link two Amigas together. You could get a cable that ran from the serial port of the machines and you could actually play. You could actually race around the same track. So you would be on your computer with your screen playing, and your friend could be on the other side of the room playing on their computer. And those early sort of multiplayer experiences, you didn't get many of those. So it was really unique and a lot of fun. And yeah, especially with the link cable, it was a brilliant idea.
Are there any aspects of today's gaming industry that you wish had existed when you started?
Yes. My first thought about this question was going to be, well, there was no internet back then. And now it's so easy to throw files back and forth and things like that. But the internet comes with a huge cost as well, in terms of productivity. And, there are downsides to the internet, and, people being able to harass people and harass developers and things like that. So it's, it has its ups and downs. But I think really the biggest thing for me is really the accessibility. Because when I was sort of starting out, the games industry seemed very impenetrable. You had these big companies that made the games, and how would I ever get a job there, and how would I ever get that experience, that kind of thing. So nowadays, the path seems a little bit easier to get into the industry, but primarily it's really the tool set that exists. So you've got game creation tools like Game Maker or Godot or Construct, Unity, Unreal, all kinds of different programs like that. So you can literally download this tool for free, download tutorials for free, and actually make a game. You just didn't have that. And, I've told these stories before. You'd literally buy a book that was 2-3 inches thick if you wanted to learn something, and you'd sit down and you'd read it, and you'd read it again until the light bulb moment went off. Or you'd try and, go to meetups or local groups or computer shows and try and talk to people who knew more than you did and pass down knowledge. But it was very difficult to learn things, and you just didn't have the internet to go to for tutorials and things. You couldn't go on Reddit and get recommendations. So there was a lot more trial and error and a lot of reinventing the wheel. But now it's never been easier. And it kind of would have been nice to have some of the modern day tools back in the day. That would have sped things up considerably.
And speaking of passing down knowledge, if a young gamer is listening to this podcast and is curious about the history of gaming, what would you encourage them to explore first, and why?
Read. Buy some books and read about video game history, because there's a lot of great books out there, about the history and the legacy. I would say try and go back to the late 70s, maybe, with the advent of things like Asteroids and Space Invaders, that kind of era. Start reading books about that era and beyond. There's so many great books out there which really give you a rough idea of what the industry was like at that time, and how it shaped the experience of making games. And there's enough books now that sort of tell the story where you can see how things change and you can see how things evolve. So, there's some. I tried to go through and sort of remember all the great books that I'd read. There's a great one called Game Over, which is all about Nintendo's sort of meteoric rise. There's another great one called Masters of Doom, which is how the game Doom was made. And Doom, obviously still, it was an incredibly important game back then, still is today. And there's some great publishers out there. There's Bitmap Books, Read Only Memories, a lot of really great games journalism out there, that cover video game history from the sort of beginnings to the modern day. Even if it's just a coffee table book, I think there's a really good book. I think it's called Supercade, which basically, huge pages are given over to the imagery and things like that, and then there's words down the side, so that you're not necessarily reading a novel. There are a lot more sort of visual and interactive. But yeah, certainly read. I think the books are going to give you a huge grounding in some of the stories that are out there, and some of the the trials and tribulations. And then second to that would be documentaries. And there's a great documentary channel on YouTube called No Clip, and they do exceptional video game documentaries. There's also, I think Sony put out documentaries regularly. They've done documentaries on The Last of Us Part 1 and 2 and things like that. Again, really good grounding in terms of, the entire process of making games. I think there's Double Fine as well. There was a couple of really good documentaries that came out of that company. And the thing about game development documentaries is they don't really need a story editor, because there's so much drama when you're just trying to make a game and get a game out the door. Even if everyone gets along and you're all pushing in the same direction, there's always going to be drama. There's always going to be, plot twists. And so, yeah, some of those documentaries can be quite raw, but they're just basically honest. Nothing is manufactured. And there's also a really great journalist called Jason Schreier, I think his name is pronounced. And he writes for Bloomberg, but he's done a couple of great books, one called Press Reset, which is all sort of tales of woe, and then another one called Blood, Sweat, and Pixels. But yeah, I think there's a place called the Video Game Library. I think they're online, Twitter and Blue Sky, and they do a lot of book recommendations every single day. So I think for me personally, that's where I would go to learn the stories, because that's where most of it is, within those pages.
What advice would you give to emerging game devs, game journalists, or anyone else you're qualified to advise considering your extensive industry experience?
The joke response is run as fast as you can. I suppose like any creative endeavor, there is a massive amount of endurance involved. And I was talking to someone about this the other day. There's a great quote by Calvin Coolidge, who is a former president of the United States, about persistence and about how, every problem known to mankind just requires persistence. It's a really interesting quote. It's well worth looking up. I can't quote it offhand. But there is a thread of truth to that. A lot of what I've done in my career, saying yes to things and opportunities, that is then followed by a huge period of persistence where you try and learn and figure things out as you go along. And even if you know what you're doing in the games industry, you can be blindsided every single day by a brand new challenge or something that you've never had to do before, which is what makes it A, really challenging, but B, really rewarding once you get through the other side of that. But I do a lecture every year for a college on the other side of Canada. And at the end of my presentation, I always talk about, if I was going to give you any advice, this is what that advice would be. And the core things are really dare to dream big. So if you have a crazy idea and it seems big and ambitious and bold, don't be afraid of that, and don't be intimidated by that, and don't be scared to tell people about that. You've got to have big dreams, because that's how things get done. If you think small and put yourself inside a box, compartmentalize yourself, those dreams will have nowhere to go. It has to be a step outside your comfort zone. The next thing would be explore your curiosities, because that's all I've ever done. And it has taken me down a really interesting path, which I could never have designed or planned. If you're sitting there and you're thinking, I wonder how, or I wonder what, follow that curiosity, because you never know where it's going to lead. You're never going to, I've tried so many things in my career, which I've been quite good at, but I never would have discovered that if I'd stayed on the same tracks. And by the same token, another piece of advice would be say yes to things. Don't be so guarded. Don't be nervous. Sometimes saying yes to something is a huge risk, but those risks pay off. So, within your comfort level for taking risks, say yes to stuff. If someone says, I've got this project, would you be interested in being involved? Say yes. Just give those things a try. And a couple of final things. Follow things to completion. So let's say, for example, you want to make a game I'm going to download Game Maker and make a simple little game. Follow that project through to completion, and see where it takes you and see what you learn. Because you could have a hard drive full of games that you've started but never finished. That is only ever going to teach you so much. But by finishing a project, no matter how big or small, you'll learn an incredible amount about the creative process. Because, getting through that last 20% of the game, you get to 80% of the way through. That last 20% feels like another 80%. Sometimes it's just that process of endurance and persistence right at the end, just to get it done. So always try and follow things through, even if it's a crappy little game that no one's ever going to play. It will honestly teach you so much about the process. And then the final thing would be to work on your craft. There's no shortcut. I know we live in an era of generative AI, and people think, well, I typed in a prompt and I created this. The blood, the sweat, the tears, the failure, the ups and downs, I can't do this, my art is terrible, the self-doubt, all those kind of negative things, that you need that to drive you along. You hear these great quotes about AI, like AI can't create in the same way as a human because AI has never had its heart broken. It's never experienced love or loss. It doesn't know the highs and the lows. And, that for me, it's very much a case of just continue to work on your craft. Some games will be good. Some games will be bad. I'm never arrogant enough to think, well, the next game is going to be brilliant and problem-free because I've learned so much in the past. You're only as good as your last game, and a new experience is going to teach you all new problems. It's going to throw all new things your way. But I think working on that craft, whether you just want to learn to draw, it's painful, it's difficult, but just sit down and learn to draw, because that discipline, and like I say, the blood, sweat, and tears that you pump into it just makes it all the more rewarding when you reach a point where you feel comfortable in your creativity.
Andy, where can people find you online?
The main place is thalamusdigital.co.uk. That's the main sort of website, but it's Thalamus Digital basically on all the socials. There's Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Twitter. I'm not calling it X, but yeah, pretty much on all the socials. And yeah, you can, if you go to the Thalamus website, there's a contact form if you want to write and ask a question. I see every email. Thalamus is a one-person operation. It's basically me and then a whole bunch of really, really talented sort of freelance devs. So I see every email. If there's a specific question or whatever, fire away. We tend to be fairly open, or you can drop us a DM on any of the social platforms.
Andy, thank you so much for your time, and all the best with your many exciting creative curiosities.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Today's mystery segment is neither mysterious nor segmented, but it does exist, and here it is.
Technically, this mystery segment is segmented because it consists of segments.
Correct. These segments feature Microprose developers discussing how games have impacted their lives and influenced their approaches to game development. And if you stick around to the end, you'll witness the first ever mystery segment within a mystery segment.
So we're just using old footage now?
Obviously. The episode's about nostalgia, so it would be lazy not to time travel our way through old episodes.
All 10 of them?
Yeah, well, no, not all 10. That's too much nostalgia.
And too much editing.
And too much repetition.
Too much repetition.
Let's start with Daniel Fowler from Dagger Directive, a tactical first-person shooter that emphasizes player choice, mission planning, and realistic combat mechanics, currently available in early access.
Took a look at older games that I really enjoyed, like Delta Force, of course, Ghost Recon, Hidden and Dangerous, and things like that, to see kind of what I liked and what I could do. And being an engineer mainly and not necessarily an artist, the older art styles is something I could actually create on my own too, so that that kind of led into that. And yeah, the game just kind of built up from there, and focusing on this full time now and having a lot of fun with it.
Now, here comes Aaron Gunnar from Nier, the first-person point-and-click adventure game.
Definitely for me, it was games like Mist and Riven that were quite there early on. But funny enough, even though they're quite inspirational artistic-wise, which is the whole reason why I started Nier, is because I wanted to create a world that people could explore. But then there were games such as Tomb Raider, Might and Magic 7, Desperados, What, Dead or Alive. A lot of different kind of games that I was really into that really took a lot of time up when I was quite young. So I think they kind of sort of draw into the inspirations behind the game as well in a lot of ways, in terms of kind of creating fantasy worlds and characters.
Next, we have the incredible Ron Gilbert from Death by Scrolling, a vertically scrolling action game where you kill enemies, collect gold, and avoid the Reaper long enough to pay the ferryman's fee.
The thing I've liked about making games very recently is just the number of people that play games, right? Games, when I first started making games are a very niche thing, right? You kind of play games and you were in this kind of group of people that play games. It was pretty small. But I think today, just about everybody plays games, right? And just having this much wider audience of people is really interesting and intriguing to me for making games, because we'd always talked about games becoming mainstream, right, back in the 80s and 90s, and they really are now, right? Everybody plays games, everybody knows about games, and it's really kind of an exciting time. And also distribution, the fact that you don't have to put something in a physical box and go find a store shelf to put it on, but that things are digital is also a lot of freedom in that.
Now, let's hear from Mech, Nils, and Martin from Sea Power, a naval combat strategy game currently in early access.
Still talking about C64 days, so early 90s, it was mostly F-19, which I loved, and Gunship.
Dreadstorm Rising, Pirates, Airborne Ranger, F-15 Strike Eagle 2. Those are my favorites.
Of course, Silent Service 1 and 2. Totally loved that game, and it was quite an inspiration for me days back. And also XCOM, Enemy Unknown. That's another one I totally love.
Next, we have Ignacio Treyes from Dying Breed, a fast-paced RTS featuring evil arch-enemies, zombies, and retro-futuristic technologies.
I always play 2.5D games, same perspective, RTS game mostly, then some RPG games. And my first games were all RTS. It was Command & Conquer 1, Red Alert, then was Total Annihilation, then I jumped into Age of Empires. I played a lot of Diablo, Warcraft 3, and I keep on growing and keep on playing those games. I was able to make a game. I wanted to do a game like that.
And finally, the moment you didn't know you were waiting for has arrived. The grand finale of this very long, very wordy, very nostalgic episode.
The grand finale is
reused mystery segment from episode 8.
Is You're Correct, Old School Edition, featuring James and JC from Gangs of Asia, a thrilling fusion of skill-based 1v1 kung fu combat and real-time strategy currently in early access.
The year is 1990-something. What is your favorite game?
So the 90s, I have to say Doom dominated the 90s. I'm going to put Doom down, lock me in.
Yeah, 90s. Mine was probably Elite 2, like Frontier. Elite 2 was what I was playing.
You're correct.
If you could be any character from a movie released prior to the year 2000, who would you be and why?
Game or movie prior to 2000? I don't know a lot of characters, but one that I'd probably never forget is probably Duke Nukem. I think there's a guy who had some adventures.
Go get some.
That's pretty good. Yeah, so mine, I couldn't think of one, but I picked John Carmack on it because he's a celebrity, so I think that's good enough.
You're correct. What was the first game you ever worked on?
Well, the first game I ever wrote was a little a maze game that I wrote when I was 10, and I had an Atari 2600 Compumate, which is like a little computer keyboard that you put on the Atari 2600 and you get like a 99 lines of basic. The first game I worked on professionally was Star Gunner that we published with. It was the last game that Apogee ever did. It's like a 2D horizontal shoot 'em up.
Yeah, my first professional game was probably Barbie on Ice, I think.
Well, guess what? You
are correct.
What is the oldest piece of gaming-related technology you currently own?
My Atari 2600 that my kids bought for me last Christmas, which I only just got a piece of hardware that I can actually plug it in and tune it to my Commodore 64 screen.
Mine's the Amiga 500. It's just the one I owned when I was young. I still have it.
I got one of those too.
So, every now and then, just for nostalgia, turn it on, boot some discs up.
You're correct.
Yeah, more correct than we were expecting.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Correct. What was the first video game you ever played, and how old were you?
When I was like 5, I have one memory of being I think it was at a zoo or botanical gardens, and they had an arcade machine outside the place where you get food. And I either had Defender or Space Invaders because there weren't many games around in those days. So I'm going to say that one.
The first game I ever owned, I think that would probably be what I would do, but it was Parachute, and it was a Game & Watch game. So that was the first game. I just remember it was, I clocked it. But that's how much I played it.
Okay.
Correct.
And I don't know if we're about to have any repetition here because it sounds like we might, but which of your childhood games do you find yourself coming back to as an adult?
XCOM, definitely, because it's just, I played it, I emulated on every device I end up playing it. Like, it's just one of those games I can play. Chronos Trigger was the other one because it's one of the first RPGs I played that I kind of become obsessed with. Org Tactics is another one. These are GBA games too, so a lot of during the GBA era I was heavily into tactic games, and then Wizardry 8 is the other one I always come back to, so it's just an old school RPG. Yeah,
I'm gonna get really old now. There's these arcade games with Time Pilot, Gyrus and Mooncrester. I used to get the emulators out and I just play them again. I think every year at some point I'll whip out Time Pilot and just do. Those games only had about 4 levels and then you just restart it again, so I'll just play them until I get through and restart.
In your opinion, correct.
Phew.
In your opinion, what is the greatest game of all time?
There's so many ways to judge that. I'm probably going to say either Doom or Minecraft, just because of the massive effect they had on the entire world.
They're good answers, so he's obviously correct. Probably Ocarina of Time. It kind of made me want to make games, yeah. So
all your answers are making me feel so old, because you say Elite 2 and then I just say the original Elite on the Commodore 64.
Yeah, no, that's ancient.
And you've just jumped forward 10 years for your answer.
Correct.
What is the last video game you played?
Well, I weekly play with some Americans online. We play 4-play cooperative games. So we just finished Hammer Watch, and we've just started Vermintide End of Times. So Vermintide End of Time and Trine. When one of the guys can't turn up and we need a 3-player game, we play Trine. So up to Trine 4 now.
Correct.
How did you know it's correct? I might have lied.
Yeah, for me, it was the last game I bought was X4 Foundations, because I think it was on sale when I bought it. It's just been sitting. I buy a lot of Steam games, and it takes me a while to get around to playing them. So, and I love space games. So, I'm liking it so far. And I've also bought Sons of the Forest, I think it is called. But yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I love survival games. Yeah, it's super. I love survival games as well. So yeah, just those ones. And on Arc Raiders, I'm playing that with mates.
You are correct.
And here is the final question. Are you feeling as old as we are right now?
No, I'm feeling older.
Correct.
Well, this has been a long episode.
Some might say too long.
And some might say not long enough.
Feel free to leave us a comment about all your favorite nostalgic moments and games and game-related memories. Would love to hear from you.
Join us next month for more exclusive interviews, gaming news, and a brand new mystery segment.
And endgame.